Good evening. Tonight's Brain Trust episode is going to be me live. I usually do slides and show you lots of science, and I've spent the last couple of days dealing with something that soon to be resolved. That I want to reassure people who are worried about me be just fine. But tonight's broadcast is not about me. Tonight's broadcast is a rant, and I won't ramble. I promise I'll stay on topic. But, you know, one way that you can really get under my skin is to go after moms and dads who care about their kids and restrict their rights. We have around the world a pattern of behavior on the parts of governments that can only be described as overreach. In Australia, raiding doctors' offices, coming up with police actions, taking patient files, and in these files, questioning the doctor's judgment on medical exemptions with government doctors overruling. We all know the score. In the United States, there is a new rash of what can only be called as medical kidnap. And I have some details to share with you, not about individual cases. I mean, I'll mention them as we go along. But in particular, where do we really stand? Where do parents stand? What are our rights? Now, I'm not a legal representative. I'm not an elected official. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not practicing law. But I do have many, many legal aids. I have a team of very well-schooled, well-honed, practiced, and very experienced lawyers. One of the advisors on IPAC's advisory board is Mary Holland, a legal scholar from New York University. When the government acts as though they have the authority to take rights away, that's when the people need to stand up. That's when the people, especially in the United States, have always recognized that we need to stand up. And I can't imagine a right that is more sacred to a mom than the bonding moments that occur right after birth. These are moments in which the mother and the child are in close physical contact. There are hormones and emotions and very real things that happen that can affect the mother's relationship with the child and the child's relationship with the mother. And there's a pattern now that we see of nurses coming in to speak with moms in a very brief, non-confrontational pattern, non-confrontational behavior. Oh, are you ready for your shots? And by that they mean at least the hepatitis B shot. And then if the mother's not ready, or if the mother is not willing, then they turn around and leave and say, okay, we're taking your child. No discussion. I'm calling Child Protective Services and we're taking your child. This happened to a mom in Florida who wanted her daughter's father present to help with the decision making, but because she delayed, the nurse said, nope, we're taking your baby. Went to Child Protective Services. That mother is now enrolled in courses that she has to take until the state has decided that she is an adequate advocate for the health and safety of her own child. This is a redoctrination program. This is a re-education program. Now, of course, what mom wouldn't go through the motions and say, you know, this is what I want. Yes, I believe this, I believe this, I believe this. This mom didn't want to come forward and didn't want her case to be made extremely public. But one of the things about this mom that really stuck out to me was that she didn't have any resources at all. She was low income. Some time goes by, and I hear about another case of a mom who's disabled in Idaho, and without any other problem with the way that she lives her life, without any other problem with her ability to care for her child, the fact that she opted out of vaccines on day one of birth, they call Child Protective Services and whisk away the child. I haven't studied that case in detail, but I'm sure you can all find the articles online. Then Sheila Ely contacted me about a case in Detroit. This was 2 days ago, I believe, or yesterday. It was yesterday, 2 days ago, in Detroit, of a mom who was low income in Detroit. Child Protective Services was threatening to come in. The nurse was threatening to bring in Child Protective Services. Low income. Then another case comes to my attention in Philadelphia. Same story. In this case, there's a medical reason not to vaccinate the child, and doesn't matter. They're threatening to bring Child Protective Services. Low income. What is happening here is, I believe, state by state by state, they want to set the precedent by which they're claiming to have the authority to take children away from parents who decide not to vaccinate. Please don't use the angry, use the smiley face and use the plus. I'll understand what you mean. If you're angry, use the plus or the heart, because the frown faces decrease the popularity of this in the feed. But what I believe is happening is they are going after low-income families who have no chance of having any substantial legal assistance. They can't afford legal aids themselves. And then they're trying to set a precedent by which it looks like they're taking children on the basis of vaccination, as if that's something that they can do legally. So I checked by asking my team of legal experts to look into this. Is there any legal basis, is the question, for a nurse or a doctor or a healthcare system on the first day of life or any day of life to say, because you're not vaccinating your child, we're going to assume custody of this child because you obviously don't have the best interest of this child at heart? Most people who are watching this already know that vaccine risk is well underestimated. Vaccine risk is extremely downplayed out of concern that if people know the real risks of vaccines, they won't subject their children to them. So here's what I had from Mary Holland. And I'm just going to read it to you. I have heard similar stories from delivery rooms in hospitals where medical people threaten moms who have just delivered with Child Protective Services if they do not authorize the birth Hep B shot that the CDC's ACIP recommends without any science to show that it's safe to newborns. Usually hospitals and Child Protective Services bootstrap vaccine refusal decisions with other issues, trying to make out cases of medical or other parental neglect. What she's saying there is, these are complicated, and they're complicated for a reason. They're choosing moms. All of these moms have relayed in one way or the other that they felt targeted. They felt picked out of the crowd, that they were going to be the ones that they were picked on. While 3 states now require vaccines for school attendance with no non-medical exemptions, all 50 states require informed consent. And no state has a requirement for compulsory vaccination at birth. I'll read that again slowly. While 3 states now require vaccines for school attendance with no non-medical exemptions, all 50 states require informed consent. And no states, that's 0 states, has a requirement for compulsory vaccination at birth. So somehow the hospital CPS must make a case out of neglect. Otherwise, there is no legal basis for child removal. No legal basis for child removal. And then she referred me to a chapter by Kim Rosenberg, contributed to the book Vaccine Epidemic, called Forced Child Removal. Now, this book, Vaccine Epidemic, is available, of course, anywhere. I'm not here to sell books. Mary sent me a copy of the chapter. She wrote, this might be helpful for any local council you are working with. So I'm going to talk with Tony Lyons and Kim Rosenberg about making this chapter freely available to everyone so that you can share it with local council. One of the most important things that we can do as a community is come together. Okay, I can complain all day long about problems, right? But what I like to do is I like to imagine that I have some ideas about some solutions, right? And one of the things that we can do as a community for parents everywhere is to educate our local legal community, okay, about what the rights are, just the basic fundamental rights in terms of informed consent. If you know the rights to informed consent, both at the state level and at the federal level, where the informed consent that the doctors are obligated to afford you the chance to exercise, it means that they have to be able to explain the benefits of a treatment, a drug, an intervention, and they have to be able to explain the risks to you, and they are required by law to do so before they apply that medical procedure to you, both the benefits and the risks. Vaccines are no exception to this. They have to tell you the risks, and that's why they give the vaccine information sheets and you sign away, yes, I understand. They're getting extremely passive-aggressive about this, where they say, okay, well, I authorize if you sign into a hospital, I authorize the hospital to conduct any medical treatment deemed necessary for the health and well-being of myself or my child. And in signing that away, they can do any medical procedure they choose, including vaccination. You've just given consent to do that. So you need to understand that that's not informed consent. And we need to talk about violations of informed consent. You cannot just sign away your right to know the risks and benefits of any medical procedure. And we need to stop thinking about vaccines as something different than any other medical procedure. All the rules that apply to you wouldn't have a surgeon just come up to you and you say, you know what, I'm going to take a quarter of your spleen out, and you don't have any right to say that you can't have that part of your spleen. You wouldn't do that. I mean, no one would put up with that. And yet, for the greater good, we're told that, okay, this is, for the good of the child and so on, that these vaccines are going to save their lives and things. Well, there's no emergency, right? Even in a mumps outbreak, there's no emergency. It's hard to make the case that a mumps outbreak is a medical emergency. So each and every time any parent has a child threatened with Child Protective Services, they need to be empowered right away. The first thing to tell them is that, you know what, somebody broke the law. What law was broken might vary from state to state, but somebody broke the law. Even if it's as simple as informed consent. The mother in Florida specifically told me that she was not, the risks and benefits of vaccines were not explained in any detail whatsoever. That her initial answer was, "What, I don't understand what you're describing to me because I'm just coming out of a C-section, and I'm on these drugs, and so I really don't understand." She communicated to the nurse, "I don't understand what you're saying to me. Are you saying now, or are you saying, am I ready in general?" And she never got a reply. That nurse specifically, that specific nurse broke the law. We need to hold medical healthcare providers individually responsible as well as their employees, which means civil court, because we're not going to get anywhere in criminal court. But they're breaking the law. By denying informed consent, they're specifically breaking the laws of informed consent at the state level and the federal level. And of course, many of you have heard me say this before, that because vaccine safety relies so heavily on market surveillance or so-called pharmacovigilance, anyone who's vaccinated at all, we've all been enrolled in a large-scale clinical trial. It's a retrospective clinical trial, but it's a clinical study nevertheless. And we were never consented to be enrolled in that. And the narrative that I think works best here is to say the 21st Century Cures Act, Congress tried to slip in a clause that indemnified IRBs and other people, that's an institutional review board, and other people conducting clinical studies from not consenting patients, which is mind-blowing if you think about where informed consent came from in the first place, to protect human rights out of the Nuremberg trials. They put a clause in there that stated you can go ahead and enroll individuals in clinical trials as long as the IRB says that the risk to the patient is minimal. Obviously, that doesn't apply to vaccine safety studies, because vaccine safety studies, we don't know that the risk is minimal until the conclusion of the study. And so the clause does not apply. And this is an interpretation that needs to be made widespread. But these parents that are being denied their rights to have their child, to have custody of their child, need to know someone broke the law. That's the first thing that they need to be told. And to find out what law was broken, and I would start with informed consent. Second thing to do, in my opinion, as a citizen, not legal aid, is to call the medical director of the facility that called Child Protective Services and let them know that you were denied informed consent and what that's going to mean to them, both as an institution and to the individual healthcare worker that denied informed consent. You're going to seek damages for that denial of informed consent in civil court. This is going to be very costly to them if they want to participate in this. Second thing to do is to look to see whether or not your state has laws against filing false complaints, okay? Because there's no legal basis for them to say that you're putting your child at risk for not vaccination, their complaint to CPS becomes a false complaint. And if those laws do exist in your state or municipality, call the police. I've said this before. If any medical official puts their hands on my child without my consent, I'm calling the police. I'm going to call it medical battery. I'm going to call the police. I'm going to say, hey, there's a man here who has my child, and they won't give my child back. I'm not going to identify them as a doctor. I'm not going to explain the vaccination. I'm just simply going to, listen, I'm over the white coat syndrome, okay? There's a man here or a woman here who has my child. We all have cell phones, okay? If they're third, oftentimes what happens is I've heard that the nurses intimidate, or the staff intimidates the parents and won't let them leave until they agree to vaccinate. That's called kidnapping. That's not medical kidnapping. That's called kidnapping. If you can't leave the room and you're being physically stopped from leaving one room to go to another room or leave the property or wherever you want to go, they have kidnapped you. Stop what you're doing, pick up the phone and say, I'm being kidnapped. Dial 911 and saying, I have just been kidnapped. And then prosecute. That's a prosecutable crime. They might say he said, she said, but you know what? Who wants to know that they're going to have to defend themselves in court over an accusation of kidnapping, especially when it's real? Another thing to take into consideration is whether or not you have not only been denied informed consent, denied the custody of your child, false, accusations or false reports to CPS, and kidnapping. Then the question is whether or not the medical community has the knowledge to determine what's right for the best interest of the child. This is a serious issue. They don't know the risks of vaccines. They can't communicate it, so you're denied informed consent. If they don't know the risks of vaccines, then how do they know that vaccinating that particular child is in the best interest of that child? And that's where you would then go to CPS court, like the mom and dad did down in Florida, okay? And you would make the case on the basis of the merits or demerits of vaccines. That's the time when you can come to us, and I mean any of us, any of us involved in this movement, and I don't mean to single myself out, but people tend to come to me. That's the time when you come to us and you say, listen, we need some fundraising because we need some legal assistance here. And I will do my very best, and everyone that I know will do our very best to get some legal assistance. The question of vaccine safety, the question of vaccine efficacy is being fought in Michigan and elsewhere around the country in the courtrooms where they think that they have gamed the system against the parents. And they don't realize this, but this is the fight that we've been waiting for. And this is the fight that we've been hoping for. All of the issues of conflicts of interest, all of the issues of thimerosal, all of the issues of aluminum are now fair game in these court cases, and we're bringing them. So if you find, everyone wants to help, right? If you find or hear about a mom or a dad who's experiencing medical kidnap or child protective services or threats like that, talk them through these options first. Use the system that exists to protect our civil rights first, before you think about, they need money for legal assistance. The other side's going to want to get it into court as soon as possible. In fact, the Child Protective Services acts like a court. There's a court of law in Florida, and these parents in Florida, the mom just had a C-section the day before, and she ended up being wheelchaired into court in front of a judge, which was a Child Protective Services agent, to hear her case. So what we have is, the ability as a community to raise funds for individual moms and dads. But what we really actually need is a parenting legal defense fund. We need a national parenting legal defense fund. I'm happy to say that at my request, there's 2 very special moms who have agreed when their cases are over that they will serve on a board overseeing a National Parenting Defense League fund. I'm not sure what it's going to be called. Mary Holland has agreed that she will be there. Kevin Barry has agreed that she will be there. And of course, I will be there, but I don't want to lead it. I don't want to have anything to do with, disbursement of funds or anything like that. But I will tell you, it's absolutely imperative that the community understand that coming together around parents like this, we will have to choose our battles. We will have to choose our battles in terms of getting experts to the location, the testimony, finding the right legal team. Not just any lawyer can come forward and say, hey, you know what, I will defend you. Although the lawyers that I've seen, especially one very special lawyer in Michigan, has done a fantastic job on a very steep learning curve in coming up with a bar. I have a great deal of confidence in what Amy Ruby is doing in Michigan. So these developments are important. How it's going to roll out, I don't really know. I'm trying to conduct traumatic brain injury research, learning things like intranasal insulin, intranasal plasma with stem cells, how it helps traumatic brain injury, and transferring that over to the autism community through research, not medical. I'm not a medical. I'm not an MD. I don't practice medicine. And so I'm grant writing. I'm grant writing for other people that have the clinical resources and so on to do this. But this is something that really gets under my skin, the violation of human rights, the violation of parenting rights. And so the final thing on this issue of medical kidnap is we need new legislation, state by state by state by state, that specifically states, point blank, in plain English, as plain can be, no medical healthcare worker, no MD, no nurse, however you want to say it, has the right to assume custody or call Child Protective Services over the question of informed consent on vaccines. Absolutely one of the most pressing, urgently needed types of legislation, new legislation. We need it in all 50 states, and we need it right now. Because unless we do this from a legislative standpoint, it's going to be their resources versus our resources. And when they co-opt the state, the there should be separation of medicine and state. We need separation of medicine and state in the United States and around the world. But when they use the state, they have unlimited resources. They have much more money than our movement does, or any individual family. And they will target many, 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 many of us. And so it'll deplete all of our resources, and we'll end up losing if we try to just fight them in court. We need to assert the legislation forward that specifically disallows, restricts the option of calling Child Protective Services over informed consent. And if that occurs, that'll send a signal to just knock it off and leave the parents alone, okay? On the first day of birth, at least on the first day of birth, every day of the life, they should leave informed consent intact. Now, there's more that I wanted to get into here. The author of that chapter was Kim Mack Rosenberg, and the book was at Vaccine Epidemics. I also wanted to review with you what I can review with you about the problem of loss of our rights to work. It amazes me that I've recently read the story, and I spoke with some of the nurses. It amazes me that 50 nurses would prefer to lose their jobs than to take the flu vaccine. That's kind of profound to me. If you think about it, in one medical healthcare system, 50 nurses would rather be unemployed than to be forced to take the flu vaccine. Now, whether each one of those nurses was going to be at any particular medical risk from the flu vaccine is debatable, right? Some people are, okay, I guess, with some flu vaccines. And some people can't handle it at all. Some people are more sensitive, but that's not the point. The point is that they have the right to say no under federal and state law, but they don't have the right to be employed at the whim of, if their employer says, you know what, I just don't want you employed with me anymore. Under federal law, I get to fire you for any reason whatsoever. Which leads me to the Michael Bailey case in Ohio. He was a patient mover who had never been vaccinated at all. He was a 6'3", strapping 50-year-old man who could lift a 250-pound patient with great ease and move the patient from bed to gurney and back. And Michael was told if he doesn't take the flu vaccine, then he's going to be fired. And he refused, and he wrote a letter stating his concern. He said specifically he thought there was something wrong with his immune system because he hadn't been sick a day in his life. He never had vaccines, but he'd never had a cold. He'd never had any communicable disease. And he sounds like a legendary person. I mean, the family has told me that at a church gathering, he was anchorman in tug of war, and he was holding anchor, and his team fell down. All other 7 members of his team fell down, and he held against 8 guys on the other side, and then they all clambered up and got it, and then they won, of course. So, very strong person. He saw 2 coworkers get fired for not taking the flu vaccine, so he relented. He didn't want to lose his pension. He had a wife who took care of him all of his life. And Michael Bailey ended up taking that flu vaccine and ended up with the diagnosis of Guillain-Barré syndrome. His case went to vaccine court, the National Vaccine Compensation Program. The HHS brought forward a doctor that, from a distance, without ever examining Michael Bailey, re-diagnosed him as having ALS. Because there was supposed to be, according to this doctor, some pre-existing condition that no one knew about. So Michael Bailey ended up, completely paralyzed, only to be able to communicate with his eyes, looking at a screen. And he ended up with an infection around his feeding tube because he had to eat through a tube in his stomach. And that led to septicemia. Michael Bailey died as a result of being paralyzed from the vaccine, which was re-diagnosed as ALS. And I can't go into any of the further details right now because, I'm an expert witness in that case. I'm working on clarifying the diagnosis with the legal teams that are at work with him and with geneticists and so on. But how many people want to say no and are forced to say yes? In every other setting, that's wrong. In date rape, it's wrong. You can't, no means no. And here, this guy, his wife is now a widow, and his son no longer has his father. And, just a wonderful, loving family. And he's gone, and yet his fight continues. Workplace violations, labor right violations include Mish Michaels. Don't forget Mish Michaels, who was hired by WGBH in Boston only to be not hired or unhired on the basis of the fact that when she was not employed, she testified on vaccine risk to a legislator. And she was going to be a science correspondent. She was a meteorologist that got basically fired after word made it through the ranks that, she had a problem with the untruths that the CDC clearly are communicating about vaccines. Other workplace violations, of course, let's not forget Dan Needy's, Dr. Dan Needy's at the Mayo Clinic. I understand that there's some developments in his life that are going to be quite positive, but still, all he did was communicate to the world his disgust at the continuation of making kids sick with vaccines. That's all he did. He's entitled to say that. But under federal law, he can be fired for any reason. Under federal law, Mish Michaels can be fired for any reason. You don't need to. Any one of us can lose a job under federal law just because the company doesn't want you working with them anymore. So the only solution that I see to this is to make it illegal for your employer to fire you over a healthcare decision. Now, you have to argue by analogy on this, right? So if I'm a woman and I choose to use birth control, they might not want to cover me in insurance, and we've had that debate in this country, and they don't have to, okay? They don't have to. Is that right? Is that wrong? Let's discuss that. But if I'm a woman and I choose to either have children or not have children, they can't fire you, right? If I choose to accept the pregnancy condition, which is a medical condition, they can't fire you. It's against the law. But that had to be fought for. That had to be written. That legislation had to be written, and it had to be voted on, and it had to be signed into law. We can change federal law on this. We can actually write a bill that says we absolutely will not tolerate anyone firing anyone over their vaccination choice. Just make it about healthcare choices. I mean, can you imagine somebody saying, well, I know you have pancreatic cancer, but because you chose radiology versus, surgery, you're fired. I'm sure it's happened, depending on which was the more expensive, copay for the employer for matching. This is private information, even to the medical community. Your vaccination status is medical information. Your boss has no business knowing it whatsoever. So this is the second most important piece of legislation that I can imagine. As a citizen, I'm not speaking as IPAC because that's not for profit, but as legislation, we need it in every state, and we need it at the federal level that says, we need a law that says that you can't be fired on the basis of your vaccine choice. There would be no stronger message that we could send of the people standing up for their rights to determine what goes in and what doesn't go into their bodies, then a reaffirmation of our rights to informed consent, our reaffirmations of the privacy of our healthcare choices. Okay? So, we've got a lot going for us right now. We're making great momentum. Chris Exley's paper is outstanding in its quality, in its depth. I mean, to actually capture right on the meninges, to actually see those cells carrying aluminum into and past the blood-brain barrier. To find the high concentrations of aluminum that we all knew was there. We're all learning. I just learned in my research on TBI and other brain disorders that amyloid in Alzheimer's is part aluminum. And guess what? It's aluminum plus silica, so it's bauxite in our brains with amyloid precursor proteins. This has been known since 1985. We know aluminum is in the brain since 1985. It's part of amyloid. It's part of the amyloid plaque. It's not a question about whether it's in the brain. We cannot have that discussion. We can't be drawn back to, 1985. We're asking the question, does aluminum appear in the brain in humans? We got a lot going for us, but we absolutely need to push in ways that are completely unexpected. And we need to hold our politicians accountable for protecting our rights to determine what goes into our bodies, to determine our rights to have and hold our children. We have to stand up, each and every medical freedom group that's out there. Your task is probably much bigger than you might have imagined when you started. Your task is no less than to protect the sanctity of our civil rights as people against a corporatocracy, against fascism. We have to use what vestiges of democracy remain in our society. We have to use them, and we have to use them quickly before they're gone too. So I promised every week that I was going to do this, that I would, take a break and talk about, the sponsors. We have Merck 1 and Merck 2, of course, the rabbits. They're the mascots of, and I don't have the picture to show you because I'm doing this live, but Merck 1 and Merck 2 are the mascots that we've adopted for Brain Trust, hashtag Brain Trust, because we want the outcome of that case soon. We want the whistleblower case in the whistleblower case of faking the data, the charges of faking the data of the efficacy of the mumps vaccine. We need that case resolved soon. One of the things that I think is a really smart idea would be all school mandates are put on hold, especially for mumps, because we don't know whether it works or not. You can't ethically use a medical procedure on people unless there's a known benefit. And if the FDA's efficacy data are in question, it would seem unethical for school boards to participate in the execution of or the application of the school requirements, mandates for school attendance. And so, you should bring this case to school board meetings and say, hey, what are you guys doing? This is a product that we have no idea whether it works or not. So maybe you should back off on these mandates. We really need some time to sort this out. And if school boards across the country start doing that, then we're going to see a lot more, expedient resolution of this case in court. So I've got a lot of ideas, not a lot of time. I met today with some of the members of Michigan for Vaccine Choice, and I would like to highlight something that I hope Del Bigtree, Catherine Layton, I hope you're listening, covers on Highwire. You should interview Betty from Michigan for Vaccine Choice, about a specific event that you can find searching for the hashtag #OrMine, hashtag ORMINE. This was an astounding event in which there was an event on vaccine hesitancy, and there was an official of some kind, a health, public health official, who was taking questions from the audience after giving some kind of presentation on, how important vaccines are and how they save the world. Just watch it. Hashtag #OrMine. It is a symbol in my mind of how far we've come, how successful we're being. Watch it, hashtag #OrMine. Watch that video and share it. And we need to have, media coverage on this. So I'm hoping Highwire might do an interview of Michigan's for Vaccine Choice. So I've asked Michigan's for Vaccine Choice to give me a list of their accomplishments, because we're still in handshake phase, and I want to learn about what they've done, and I want to celebrate what they've done so far. And I'm sure that they've done a lot. I can tell by their organization and the depth of their membership. And so I don't have an unofficial sponsor for Brain Trust this week, but I do want to give a shout out to Michigan's for Vaccine Choice. And we have every app. Yeah, Mayo, you're right, Donna. So Dan Needy's was at the Cleveland Clinic, not the Mayo Clinic, sorry. We have everything on our side. We've got the numbers. We've got the bully pulpit position. We have a growing number, unfortunately, of people who are vaccine injured and people who know people who are vaccine injured and loved ones. But we can't move fast enough. So I want to challenge every medical freedom group that's out there. As soon as possible, hammer together some legislation and draft it yourselves. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to state what you think the bill should say. Take it to your legislator and get them to sponsor it, get them to rewrite it, get them to draft it, petition to try to get a co-sponsor, 10, and then get this legislation through. There's other legislation that would be much more immediate and effective, like banning unsafe epitopes in vaccines. One state, if one state in the United States bans unsafe epitopes, that would require vaccine manufacturers to check their epitopes for matches to human proteins. Banning thimerosal, one state. World Mercury Project wants that done in a big way worldwide. One state in the United States bans thimerosal, they'd have to take it out of all vaccines. One state to focus on aluminum and make sure that pediatric dosing of aluminum considers body weight. And so divide and conquer. Let's use the numbers that we have. Let's use the disposition that we have. Whichever state would like to raise their hand and say, I'll be the state that goes forward and tries to ban unsafe epitopes, great. Let me know what I can do to help. I can advise on the science, okay? I can't advocate for that legislation once it becomes real. I can talk with you now, but I can't then advocate for that legislation once it becomes real because I'm a not-for-profit. I mean, not me, that's the wrong way to say it, but IPAC is a not-for-profit. The research that we're doing in IPAC is going to change the world. It's absolutely going to change the world. We're going to see research in autism that you didn't think was possible before. All of the options that parents are trying out on their kids. I've said this before, I'm going to say it outright. It's unethical to experiment on your child. It's unethical to try to chelate your child. It's unethical to try any treatment on your child as if, but you love your children. People love their children and they want them better. They want them to be able to speak. They want them to not be aggressive. They want them to be able to socialize better, whatever it is that you want for your child. But it's unethical to take that on as your own experiment, and so it should be done in the safety of a clinical trial. Whatever specific protocols we think as a community work best should be subjected to clinical scrutiny in a clinical trial. IPAC wants to make sure that that happens. I want to make sure that that happens. So in working with researchers in TBI, I'm learning a lot about traumatic brain injury. Guess what? You have microglial activation there. If you have pre-existing mitochondrial deficiency, or more concussions more likely to be more severe, etc. I'm learning about intranasal glutathione, intranasal insulin, which clears out amyloid plaque. I'm learning, and then at the same time, that kids with aggressive autism have high amounts of amyloid precursor protein. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy, I've got a massive review on that of off-label, I've just written that up. We want to do these clinical studies, and we want to do it in a way that universities, I know people don't trust universities, but there are ethical people that work and live at universities and do good research in autism. Universities and other medical research facilities can do bona fide research without the government being involved at all. I don't think the NIH is relevant to the autism community at all. The NIH is irrelevant to autism research. You can quote that. What we want is funding from major foundations, not IPAC. What we want is funding from major foundations or major donors that IPAC would then make sure is spent appropriately. And I don't have to handle the money. IPAC doesn't have to handle the money. We can handle the grant review process. So if we put out a call for proposals backed by funding to do the research that your community needs, that our community needs done, we can handle grant proposals and we can disperse the funds appropriately. We had some experience in doing this with cannabis research, safety of a product. We got a grant proposal in, and then the funder decided to go overseas. But there's other studies that, we're trying to get funding for. So I've written grant proposals for people. Naya Hanscom is working with IPAC I try to identify sources of funding for her app, Saying It Sam, which she wants tested. God bless her. She wants it tested, even though she's already spent $150,000 in developing that app herself. She wants to know before she puts it out there in a big way that it's actually going to help kids learn how to communicate better. She doesn't want to make an unwarranted claim. Now, if it's just an app and it runs on a pad, she wants research behind it. And if it doesn't help, she wants to know how to improve it, or she wants to know it doesn't help because she's ethical. It's pretty simple to be ethical. Take care of your kids, take care of yourself, take care of each other. Thank you for listening. Brain Trust is my new baby. We are vaxxed. Thank you for having me. I am so thrilled at the direction that we're going in. I want to thank everybody who's communicated with me over the past 2 weeks on these topics. Find the Brain Trust group on Facebook. There was a huge discussion on medical kidnap and what to do with Child Protective Service if Child Protective Services takes your child. Find the Brain Trust group on Facebook and join it. And there's a very good discussion there with very good resources. I want to thank Valley especially and others who contributed to that discussion. I haven't had time to absorb it all myself, but I got some key talking points, so thank you so much. Polly and Bella and everyone on the VAX team, I want to thank you. And Anu, if you're listening, I promise I will get to ordering those slides for you. Thank you. Have a great night.